On the morning of February the 25th, 2009, Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 becomes the first plane to crash at Amsterdam's Schiphol airport in more than 10 years.
It smashed into the ground really hard. It made a tremendous noise.
The plane hits the ground in a muddy field just north of runway 18 right. Since the crash was so close to the airport, rescue workers arrive quickly. Most of the passengers have survived, but many are badly injured. Survivors are taken straight to local hospitals. Images of the Amsterdam accident quickly spread around the world. This is the third crash of a passenger jet in the past 6 weeks. The sudden nature of this accident adds to the mystery. It doesn't take long for the Dutch safety board to arrive at the scene. They will be investigating this accident, but they won't be alone. The crash involved an American-made plane, so the US National Transportation Safety Board sends Joe Sador, one of its most experienced investigators, to Amsterdam.
When it's a non-US registered aircraft that crashes overseas, such as this Turkish Airlines, we are the state of manufacture and design of the airframe, and also in this case the engines.
Fuselage in 3 large pieces, engines forward of the main wreck site.
Flight 1951 was one of the most advanced aircraft in the skies, the Boeing 737-800 series. It's designed to travel longer routes at higher altitudes.
The new generation 737 is still the best airplane Boeing ever built. We developed an airplane that had an improved wing, improved avionics, simpler systems that required less maintenance.
Investigators know this isn't just any plane. The 737 is the world's best-selling commercial jet. Finding out why this one crashed is imperative. There are more than 5,000 of them in the skies. They carry about 1.5 million passengers a day. Investigators must quickly determine if there's a flaw with the plane that could cause another accident. What they know so far is that Flight 1951 had been traveling from Istanbul, Turkey, to Amsterdam. There were 128 passengers on board the early morning flight, including 4 engineers from Boeing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent towards Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. Please raise your seat backs to the upright position and stow away your tray tables.
There was no mention on board of any kind of trouble in the cockpit. The crash has killed 9 people, including 3 members of the Boeing team and the pilots in the cockpit.
See if you can get me some aerials of the crash site.
There are eerie similarities to another recent accident involving a Boeing aircraft, British Airways Flight 38.
Approximately a year before this, there had been a 777 short landing at Heathrow, which had a dual-engine flameout.
In that accident, a Boeing 777 fell to the ground short of the runway. The British Airways pilots reported that both their engines stopped delivering power just before landing. At the time of the Turkish Airways crash, the cause of that accident hasn't been found. Like in that case, investigators have plenty of clues to work with. The plane and its engines are largely intact. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder are found in good condition. There are also plenty of survivors to describe what happened. According to the passengers, the landing had been routine, but then suddenly the plane simply dropped out of the sky and hit the ground. But perhaps the biggest clue comes from the crash site itself. The wreckage is not spread out. It tells investigators that the plane could not have been traveling forward at high speed when it hit the ground.
The way the aircraft had crashed, it did appear to be some sort of a landing accident in which there was moderate control of some sort.
The pattern of debris and the passenger reports point investigators to an immediate suspect: the engines.
The engines issue was a very big issue in my thought process at the time, initially.
There's no evidence of fire on the fuselage. In many crashes, fuel in the plane's tanks ignites on impact. The lack of fire raises an obvious question. Did the engines stop running because Flight 1951 had simply run out of gas?
That was one of the first thoughts that I had was, did this airplane have fuel aboard? Because otherwise, how does a 737 literally fall out of the sky on approach to an airport?
But the location and condition of the plane's engines suggest that perhaps they didn't quit in flight.
Sure looks like it was running.
When we first looked at where the engines ended up, the initial impression was that they probably were producing thrust at impact, given that they were so far forward of the main wreckage. That was just a very general conclusion.
Only the flight data recorder can tell investigators how much power the engines were generating in the seconds before the crash.
Lots of fuel. Rules that out.
It doesn't take long to discover that there was plenty of fuel in the plane's tanks. Flight 1951 definitely did not run out of gas. Passengers report that in the final seconds before the crash, the plane hit what felt like turbulence. It points investigators to a well-known culprit, a microburst. A microburst is a powerful column of air that shoots out of storm clouds. It can literally slam a low-flying plane to the ground.
If an airplane flies into that at approach speeds, you're not going to be flying anymore. You're going to come out of the sky. Certainly, it was one of the things that all of us took a look at the beginning. Was there a microburst?
In 1985, a Delta Airlines flight was caught in a microburst while landing at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. The plane hit the ground short of the runway. 137 people were killed. Investigators learned that there were heavy clouds above the airport at the time of the accident. A powerful gust of wind may well have accompanied them. The flight data recorder will have recorded wind speeds outside the plane. Investigators will need to analyze the flight data to prove the microburst theory. In the meantime, the rescue has led to an unusual discovery.
There was 3 pilots in the cockpit, which is unusual. This is a 2-crew cockpit. So why was that 3rd pilot there?
Since none of the 3 pilots survived the accident, it's all the more urgent for investigators to retrieve the data from the cockpit voice recorder. It records conversations in the cockpit. They're in luck.
Because of the way that the aircraft crashed, access to the recorders and the condition of the recorders was excellent.
The reason for the 3rd pilot is soon uncovered.
Flying standard arrival route, visibility 3,500 meters, expected to decrease to 2,500 meters.
For First Officer Murat Sezer, this had been a training flight of sorts. He was new to the airline and was being shown the intricacies of landing at Amsterdam's airport.
In the Jepson charts, which is what all pilots use to navigate to and from Schiphol, there's 102 pages of information on Schiphol alone. So there's dozens of approaches.
Runway 18 right has 3 high-speed exits to the left.
The captain, Hassan Arisan, was doing double duty. He was training his first officer.
Make small corrections as we get close to the runway.
And was in command of Flight 1951. It's because Captain Arisan was teaching that there was the 3rd pilot in the cockpit. Olgay Ozgur was a safety pilot. He was there to keep an eye on the flight's progress during this training mission.
The purpose of that 2nd set of eyes is to make sure that the captain and the first officer, if they're in a situation where it's a little bit of a training portion of the flight, that they don't miss something.
We've got a clean recording.
The voice recorder reveals that the 3 crew members began preparations for landing when still above 8,500 feet.
Amsterdam, Turkish 1951, descending to 7,000, speed 250.
But the voice recorder has picked up an unusual sound, a warning that makes no sense at this stage of the flight.
One of the investigators from Boeing was a engineering pilot that came and helped with the CVR. And he's listening to see when, or are there any unusual sounds that can be heard that would not be normal.
Speed okay for ILS 18 right. Descent 4000, ILS 18 right.
The alarm keeps sounding. It's the landing gear configuration warning horn. Captain Arasan continually dismisses it.
Turkish 1951, descent 4000, ILS 18 right. Landing gear.
Is that the landing gear warning? They're at 8,300 feet here.
The warning is a solid clue, but investigators can't yet see how it could possibly have caused a crash. The crew of Turkish Airlines Flight 1951 got warnings to extend their landing gear while still thousands of feet in the air.
On the initial listen, we heard a gear warning horn occur as the aircraft was approaching, when it was still up and it was coming in about 10,000 feet and below.
Investigators now turn to the flight data recorder to help solve some of the mystery surrounding this flight. The analysis of wind speeds outside the aircraft is completed. It's clear, none are drastic enough to have brought down the plane.
Evidence of a microburst.
But the flight data recorder does provide some valuable insight into the cause of the landing gear warning. One of the instruments that measures altitude had the plane already on the ground.
When we looked and saw the radio altimeter data, on the recorder it showed about 8,000 feet, and then immediately it went down to about -8. -8 feet is an indication that the aircraft's on the ground, but of course it's still at 2,000 feet.
The Boeing 737 is equipped with two separate altimeters. One measures air pressure to determine the plane's height above sea level. That reading is displayed prominently in the cockpit on both pilots' flight display.
10, set, sir.
The plane is also equipped with a radio altimeter. It's made up of 4 antennas. 2 transmit signals to the ground, and 2 others read the signal that bounces back to determine the plane's height.
It's precise. It's very, very precise. Pressure altimeters can sometimes be not as accurate, and radar altimeters are 100% accurate if they're working properly.
One antenna feeds the reading to the first officer's display. The other feeds the captain's instruments. In the case of Flight 1951, the captain's side was wrong most of the flight. Investigators go back over the CVR and make a puzzling discovery.
Amsterdam, Turkish 1951, descending to 7,000, speed 250. Radio altimeter.
Captain Arasan seems to have known that the landing gear warning was being caused by a faulty radio altimeter.
The airplane thought that it was low to the ground and the gear was not down. And the captain recognized that the problem was really in the radio altimeter, showing him that they should be on the ground, and he goes, it's just the radio altimeter.
Throughout much of the approach, the captain's radio altimeter had been displaying a reading of -8 feet, triggering the warning to lower the gear.
They treated it like it was a nuisance.
Turkish 1951.
Descend to 2,000.
2,000, 1951.
Investigators dig for any other abnormalities. They learn that with Flight 1951 still about 17 kilometers from the airport, controllers directed the pilots to begin their final turn to line up with the runway.
Turkish 1951, left heading.
210, cleared approach.
18 right.
Left 210, cleared ILS, Turkish 1951.
210, set, sir.
This turn puts Flight 1951 in line with runway 18 right. It's equipped with an instrument landing system, which sends out a signal outlining the ideal descent path to the foot of the runway. The autopilot follows that glide path until the plane is a few hundred feet from the ground. Then the pilot takes over. It makes landing almost effortless.
The ILS is pretty easy to follow. It's a video game. My daughter has flown in a simulator and can land a 737 using the ILS.
The crew begins configuring their plane for landing, unfazed by the warning horn that's repeatedly triggered by the malfunctioning radio altimeter.
Flaps 15.
10 kilometers out, Flight 1951 picks up the ILS signal that will guide the plane to the runway.
Localizer alive. Localizer capture.
The safety pilot, Olgay Ojgur, now reminds Captain Arasan about the failed altimeter.
We have radio altimeter failure, sir.
Okay.
Turkish 1951.
Runway 18 right.
Clear to land.
Clear to land. Thank you.
Investigators are stumped. The crew knew about the malfunction and continued their approach. How had it then caused them to crash? Clearly, there was more to this accident than a faulty altimeter.
The whole premise of airline safety, the way we build the airplanes, the way we fly them, is based on the idea that we can have any number of failures and we should still be able to arrive safely. The radio altimeter is just one instrument. There's no way in the world that that one instrument, if it fails, should be a major cause of worry that we're going to have a crash.
Investigators wonder if the crew had been given proper guidance for their approach. They turn to exchanges between the pilots and the controller who guided them in. They carefully review every instruction.
Turkish 1951, descend to 4,000. Speed OK for ILS 18 right. Turkish 1951, descend to 2,000. Turkish 1951, left heading 210, cleared approach 18 right.
By following the controller's instructions, the crew made their final turn much too close to the runway.
So to intercept properly, they should be here.
International guidelines call for approaching planes to intercept the signal that guides them to the runway from below. It's so pilots don't have to make any drastic last-minute course corrections to get to it.
To intercept here, they had to descend.
But Flight 1951 was given instructions that brought it to the threshold of the glide slope while still way above it. It's a common practice at Schiphol because it gets planes to the runway faster.
Because they were so close, they had to capture the glide slope from above. Although it is an unusual situation, it is one that can be handled by a flight crew if it is managed properly.
Approaching a glide slope from above is more difficult, mostly because the crew has to suddenly slow the plane and descend rapidly to intercept the signal.
We also call this a slam dunk approach, and some pilots like it, some pilots don't. It's a little bit harder, and things happen quicker when you're above the glide path trying to intercept from above, and it's just a challenge for a lot of pilots.
The approach from above increased the crew's workload, but it's standard practice at Schiphol Airport.
I've flown into Schiphol dozens of times, and I expect it.
If the controller's instructions had somehow overtaxed this crew, their conversations would indicate it. They're just 5 kilometers from the runway.
1,000.
Check.
Flaps 40. Speed brake.
Speed brake armed. Green light.
One thing at a time. Landing gear.
Gear down. 3 green.
Flaps.
Flaps 40. Green light.
500.
All lights on.
Please warn the cabin crew.
Cabin crew, take your seats.
Then, real trouble. A stall warning.
Speed, sir.
I have control.
100 knots of speed.
Arasan fought to save his plane, but just 400 feet above the ground and only 1.5 kilometers from the runway, the Boeing 737 suddenly fell straight down. It only took a few seconds for it to hit the ground.
1951.
The recording sheds light on the final minutes of the flight. The crew was configuring their plane for landing well after it should have been done.
Flaps.
Flaps 40, green light.
Most airlines have regulations that call for a flight to be stabilized, to have all checklists completed by the time the plane hits 1,000 feet.
In instrument conditions, you're required at 1,000 feet to have basically everything done. The airplane is configured, you have slowed, you have run your before landing check, and you have received your landing clearance. And from 1,000 feet on in, you just monitor the instruments, and we're looking for the runway.
Please warn the cabin crew.
In fact, this crew was still running their checklist up to the moment the crisis hit, 460 feet above the ground.
This approach was not stabilized.
Because the aircraft was unstable, the flight crew was in a very high workload environment in the last 1,000 feet of flight.
The radio altimeter was malfunctioning. The aircraft was giving off warnings. The crew was assigned a challenging approach, and they were executing a checklist late. But none of this explains why Flight 1951 crashed.
In these type of accidents, you can never get inside the head of the pilots. And that's a very frustrating type of accident.
But the flight data recorder does provide another intriguing clue. Moments before Flight 1951 hit the ground, the plane's engines were at idle, hardly providing any power. Perhaps this accident is a repeat of the Heathrow incident.
The engines, it was interesting to note, were at idle approximately the last 2 minutes of flight, until the very end when the thrust was increased again. That was a big red flag right there. The question is why was that the case?
But then they spot something that's very different from the accident at Heathrow.
Retard flare mode.
For some reason, while still more than 1,000 feet above the ground, the plane's computer began preparing to touch down. In retard flare mode, engine power is reduced to idle by the flight computer, and the plane's nose automatically pitches up to the flare position. Planes should only be in this configuration just before they touch the ground.
The autopilot raises the nose to break the descent. The autothrottles brings the power back to flight idle, and you touch down with the power either all the way in idle or just about to be in idle.
But Flight 1951 went into a slow, nose-up position well before touchdown, causing the plane to fly slower and slower throughout its descent. So why was Flight 1951 in landing mode? And why hadn't any of the 3 crew members noticed how slowly they were flying?